The lighthouse that shines at midnight. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. After a year of non-stop work, I needed to escape the noise of the city, the emails, the deadlines. I wanted solitude, a place where I could breathe and not feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. So, when I found a listing for a secluded seaside cottage, I booked it without a second thought. The description was simple, cozy, peaceful, near an old lighthouse. It sounded perfect. The drive took me farther and farther away from civilization. The road narrowed into a single-lane path, the trees growing thicker until they gave way to open cliffs and the endless grey expanse of the ocean. The cottage was perched on a rocky outcrop, its paint weathered by the salty air, and just beyond it, at the edge of the cliff, stood the lighthouse. The lighthouse was taller than I expected, its white paint streaked with rust, the glass of its lantern room cloudy with age. I assumed it was abandoned. There was no mention of it being operational. Yet something about it seemed alive, as though it were watching over the empty sea. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, but decided to settle into the cottage first. The cottage itself was charming in a rustic way, wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and large windows that framed the ocean view. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, just the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, and the occasional cry of a gull. It was exactly what I needed. I spent the first evening with a book and a glass of wine, the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. But then, at midnight, the lighthouse lit up. I was sitting by the window, watching the moonlight dance on the waves, when the beam of the lighthouse swept across the sea. It startled me, a sudden flash of light that felt impossibly bright. The beam moved in slow, deliberate circles, cutting through the darkness like a knife. I watched it for a long time, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. The longer I watched, the more unsettled I felt. The light wasn't steady. It flickered like an old film reel, and every so often, it seemed to focus, as though searching for something. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation was already playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the light wasn't random. It was deliberate. The next morning, the lighthouse was dark, just as I had expected it to be. I decided to investigate. The path leading to the lighthouse was overgrown, the grass damp with morning dew. When I reached the base, I saw that the door was ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. The interior was cold and smelled of mildew. A spiral staircase wound upward, its metal steps rusted and uneven. As I climbed, the sound of the wind outside seemed to fade, replaced by a low hum that grew louder with every step. The air felt heavier, almost electric, as though the lighthouse itself was alive. When I reached the lantern room, I found it empty. The massive lens stood silent, its surface covered in grime, the machinery that should have powered it long rusted and broken. There was no way it could have lit up the night before. Yet, as I stood there, staring out at the endless horizon, I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The hum grew louder, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air. I stumbled back down the stairs, my heart racing, and didn't stop running until I was back at the cottage. That night, I locked the doors and drew the curtains, determined to ignore the lighthouse. I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, some reflection off the water, an optical illusion. But at midnight, the beam returned. This time, it was different. The light wasn't sweeping across the sea, it was fixed, pointing directly at the cottage. My breath caught in my throat as the beam pierced through the curtains, illuminating the room in stark white light. It was so bright, I had to shield my eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. But when I tried to leave, the car wouldn't start. I checked the battery, the fuel, everything I could think of, but the car was dead. I considered walking back to town, but the thought of trekking miles through the empty wilderness filled me with dread. I was trapped. As the day wore on, the weather turned. Storm clouds rolled in, dark and heavy, and by evening, rain was lashing against the windows. The sound of thunder echoed across the cliffs, and the waves crashed with a ferocity that shook the ground. I sat by the fireplace, trying to calm myself, when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, louder, more insistent. I froze, my heart pounding. No one should have been out here, not in this storm, not at this hour. The knock came again, and this time I forced myself to move. I approached the door slowly, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door a crack, the rain slamming against it, and looked out. The path to the lighthouse was visible in the storm's light, and at its end, the door to the lighthouse stood wide open. A faint glow emanated from within, pulsing like a heartbeat. I don't know why I went. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the storm, the wind tearing at my clothes as I made my way toward the lighthouse. Inside, the hum was deafening. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and as I climbed, I felt the air grow colder, heavier, as though I was ascending into another world. When I reached the lantern room, the light was blinding, a swirling vortex of white and gold that filled the entire space. I shielded my eyes and stepped closer. In the center of the light, I saw them. Figures, barely human, their forms flickering like static on an old television screen. They moved in and out of the light, their faces featureless, their movements slow and deliberate. They seemed to notice me, turning toward me in unison, and though they had no eyes, I felt their gaze pierce through me. One of them raised an arm, pointing out toward the sea. I turned, following its gesture, and for the first time, I saw a massive shadow beneath the waves, something ancient and vast, its form shifting and undulating in the depths. The light from the lighthouse wasn't guiding ships. It was calling. I don't remember how I got back to the cottage. The storm had stopped, and the lighthouse was dark once more. My car started the next morning without issue, and I left without looking back. But the dreams have followed me. Every night, I see the light, the figures, and the shadow in the sea. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the same low, resonant hum that still vibrates deep in my bones. I don't know what the lighthouse called that night, but I fear it hasn't finished.